Welcome to Monday Morning Coffee with Inside the Firm. Each week, our hosts will be interviewing local, regional, and national business leaders to give you an inside peek into how they lead their business to success in the ever-competitive business climate.
Welcome to another edition of Monday Morning Coffee, Inside the Firm. I'm your host today, Alex Gore. I'm here with Scott Reynolds of UpCodes. Scott, how are you doing today?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Yeah. So Scott, tell us about what you do at the company. When did you come to, be involved in it, and your area expertise there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at UpCodes. But initially, and I should say it's an online tech product. We do building codes online. But way before that, background was in architecture. Went to architecture school, got a BR, worked internationally for a little bit, came back to the US and worked here. So my background very much is rooted in architecture, but kind of took a long journey to transition into tech and started UpCodes around 4.5 years ago now, together with my brother, who's coming from the software engineering side. So now kind of operate day-to-day functions at UpCodes and really focus on the product, what we build and what we're going to build in the future, and kind of sequencing that roadmap.
Where did you go to architecture school, and how many years did you have outside of school before you started UpCodes?
Yeah, so went to school at Syracuse University, again, for their VR program. I know they do a master's as well. So did the 5-year program there, after graduation, went to the UK, to London, but did a graphic design internship in motion graphics. So kind of like intro sequences to movies and TV shows. So really interesting experience. Did that for about 6 months, and then went to Hong Kong for 3 years, doing architecture work there. So that was kind of like my real architecture job, where it was at least in real practice, like outside of internships and things like that. So did that for a couple of years, then moved to New York City, where I worked for Cohn Peterson Fox, or KPF, and worked there for I think a little over 6 months in their New York office. So back to your original question, around probably
what year were you in New York?
Good question. It probably was 2016 or 2015. So this is a couple years back.
Gotcha. Okay. Who thought of this idea? Was it you? Was it your brother? How did it come across? And then actually walk through, because, there's the idea, but then when to implement it, and then how to implement it, because there's a lot of great ideas. Like, my cousin said, this was years ago when I couldn't even drink. The freeze pops? We were in the hot tub. Yeah. And I swear this was like 92 or something. He's like, oh, we need these with alcohol. It's like, yeah, that's a great idea. He never did it. Someone else did it. It is a great idea. But did you have multiple ideas and then just land on this? Take us back to that kind of time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a lot of ideas. And just like you said, like ideas are pretty cheap. Execution is everything, and putting together the right team. So I was kind of just always had an interest in tech companies, would fly out and visit my brother in Silicon Valley, specifically in San Francisco. And at the time he was working at PlaneGrid. So another kind of construction related startup, putting blueprints in the cloud, recently acquired by Autodesk. But at the time, they're independent. I would go to their offices. I was like, this is incredible. I love the fast pace of building a tech product. So that's really where I wanted to head. But it was going to take some kind of transition or segue from architecture to get into tech. So I was like, let me identify a interesting idea to pursue as a side project, and that will teach me the ropes of what it takes to ship a tech product. So at that time, 2015 or 2016, I was in New York. Actually, let me back up even further.
Yeah.
When I was working in Hong Kong, I was really just the kind of conduit of information between the design team in New York and the boots on the ground in mainland China. And really wasn't doing any design work, was just kind of faring back and forth. What are the design constraints? Primarily code. So we were figuring out, okay, what are the codes in Shenzhen, in southern China? And there are huge hurdles. So not, code compliance on its own is pretty difficult, even more difficult if it's written in a foreign language. So there's translation issues, and I'm like, this is a really difficult process. And I really want to get back to design. So I transitioned to New York and started witnessing domestic projects and realized the compliance was even harder. There was no translation barrier there, but just the amount of regulations was larger. They're more stringent, so it was more difficult to comply with. So I was kind of taken aback, and that ended up being maybe one of 5 ideas that I was kind of putting together. I had like notebooks, and I was just sketching out ideas and doing preliminary research. And then I would go to my brother, who is a software engineer, is like, okay, what of these ideas do you think software could suit best? And I think it was one Thanksgiving, I forgot which year it was, but he flew out to New York, stayed with me in my apartment at the time, and we just hacked on some of the ideas. We just kind of tried to set up prototypes and see what would work. And what seemed the most interesting was getting some of these building regulations and making it searchable. And it's very crude. Like that version 0.1 was you had to URL enter, or it's called URL hacking, but like basically type into the URL what your search query would be. There's no user interface.
You mean just like hit Control Find, like Control F? That's
a little more advanced than that. Like it would send it back to the server, and it would query the database and send you back search results, kind of like Google, but completely unformatted. And more like, it looks like a computer terminal.
Yeah.
So really, really basic. But that's basically where the idea came from. It was kind of generating a few potentials, bouncing the ideas off with my brother, and then trying to put up some prototypes to see what could work.
Who was actually doing the prototypes? Like making them physically? And then was this while you had a job and you're doing this at night, on the weekends, whatever?
Exactly. Yeah. So it was when I had the full-time job, and we were just doing it, at night times and on the weekend. And it was Garrett. So he was doing all of the technical implementation. And because there was no user interface, there wasn't much for me to do on that front, except for a lot of the research. So, I had worked on international projects and New York City projects, but I really didn't know what code meant from a national level. Like what are the adoptions? How does it change state to state? So there's a lot of this kind of business research that I was doing at the time, and he was hacking together these prototypes.
Yeah. And even though it's not that long ago that you mentioned it, 2015, 16, it seems like longer than that. But from a user perspective, essentially every time, we have some code books, right? But there's a lot of different code books, and there's a lot of different years. And sometimes people aren't in the office. And back then, how you'd have to find code online is like you'd either Google it and try to find it, or you'd go to the ICC, and then honestly, it would take a while to get to the actual PDF. Or sometimes the building department would have links, but it was always like I couldn't just give an answer. Like, they're in 2016, and we've been literally doing 2009, right? So like our office book is 2009, and then someone updated actually to 2015. There isn't a 16. And we didn't have it. So like, I just have to say, find it. But then eventually I found UpCodes. I go, you just go to UpCodes. They're like, what? Yeah. Up.codes. You'll find it. So, I mean, it was great in that there was one source to find all this that was easy. And it was user interface is huge, just like the iPod, right? The music one. There was a bunch of different ones. It's just this one had the best user interface, and it took off. And the iPhone, same thing. So that's mainly what we use it for. But then you started developing other things. Like I think I even tested it once, and you could. I think it was your exit widths or something like that. Go into and keep along with the story is like, what versions, what things did you decide to start adding to it? That probably takes time and resources and money. Then you have to get it. So continue on the story from, hey, you're making it, and this guy has just found a website just has the codes in one place, because there's more to it than that.
Yeah. And yeah, it's crazy. But like a couple of years ago, it's hard to remember now, but it was so fragmented. The where you could find, I mean, it still is for a large part of the space, but like, we would have a company server with PDFs, and you didn't quite know what version that PDF was or what year it was saved. We had a physical library of code books. You could go onto government websites. You could go onto the ICC site, and it was it was so difficult to patch together what are the most up to date and composite kind of set of code around this project. And it was such a kind of ridiculous barrier to even start the project. Like, why should we ever struggle with finding the right information before we, start digesting that and understanding how it applies to our projects? So the first thing was just, let's get that all into one place. Let's unify it. So it's not, you don't have amendments from the government and then with an adopted code book and that are in different formats. So let's get that all together. Let's unify it into a database and make it searchable. And it sounds very simple, but that actually took a lot of time to do and to gather up all that information. And just like you said, the user interface took, and we're constantly refining even today, but early on it was a lot of research, a lot of user testing. How can people best work with this code and what format would they expect? And just, how can we enable them to browse through and read the code the easiest? But back then, I don't know if folks will remember, but there was something called, I think it was CyberRegs, which was the ICC's version of an online code resource. And it was really, really difficult to use. I think every section of code was its own web page, so you couldn't see like a full chapter of code. And it was really difficult to not only browse sections, but search through it, and it's very difficult to work with. So early on, that the big piece to get in place was, let's just unify this data, let's put it all into one place, let's make it easy to browse. And then you mentioned getting into like egress widths and things like that. That's been a lot of the last 12 months, is kind of like going off this foundation. Now that we have all this information together, let's start creating some interesting tools. And frankly, I think this is where it's going to get really exciting, is because now we've built that foundation. It's like, what kind of tools can you do to help kind of automate that process, or be more of go beyond just a code lookup or a repository, and start to really enable proactively for the designers. So that's kind of like what we've been getting into in the last year.
And just to give people some overviews, we should have went over this in the beginning, but you have over 400,000 monthly active users. You have over 1 million sections of codes, and have integrated over 50,000 state and local amendments. And what's huge about that is when you learn the lesson that a local one piece of code in the construction side, so we're also builders now, right, can cost you $10,000 just on a small house, and you're already 3/4 of the way down the project. And that's just a house. I'm not even talking about a multifamily structure or something like that. And it's only because the city has their adoptions, and they've changed 40 pages of code, and maybe you didn't go look at it because it's all technical nonsense and it's, hard and difficult. And it's like, why would you change the IBC? Who do you think you are? Like, why do you think that you are smarter than the IBC to do this little code that messes me up? It's huge. What you're doing is huge and very, very important. So congratulations on that. Thank you for that. And then I wanted to talk about so you have all the codes in one project, there's three main points that you have on your websites. Your code library all in one place. Understanding code's relevance to your projects. So that's the search engine. And then structured research and project-based coordination. What does that mean?
Yeah, so that's diving off of the kind of that foundation I was mentioning. So now you have all the codes in one place. You can search it. You can browse it. But what can you do to kind of be a design aid for the designer or for the GC or the plans examiner or building inspector? How can you start to streamline that research process? And that's where a lot of the new functionality comes into play. So one of the big new tools, code calculators, is taking project inputs and then automatically doing some of these calculations and then shooting out a code sheet on the other end of the process. So trying to minimize the amount of information in and maximize the amount of information out on the other side. So if we have an understanding of, or the system has an understanding of where you're located, what's your construction type, what are the occupancies, what kind of sprinklering are you proposing, you can see the downstream code implications. So things like building heights and areas, egress, plumbing fixture counts, accessibility. All these kind of code requirements that would otherwise be quite difficult to kind of go and dig through. So one of the advantages there is that you can iterate quite quickly. You can say, hey, if I upgrade my construction type, or if I put this sprinklering in, or if I do a separated mixed-use building, what can I get away with, and what are going to be my outputs on the way out. So we're trying to tighten that iteration cycle as fast as possible to help with those really basic kind of calculations for the user.
Is that literally on the website? You log in and it's literally inputs, and then it will spit out an output. Is that how it works?
Exactly. And I should mention too, there's two tiers of the website. So one is the free tier, and kind of our ethos has always been from day one, like all code should be free to access for users. Things like copy, paste, print, just like the basics of accessing code should be free. We're all bound by it. It's law, so everyone should access it. So that's all in the free tier. So we'll integrate amendments and structure it and make it easy to view, hyperlink, and do all those things. Then that's all in the free tier. Then the premium tier for the power users are these tools we're talking about. So that, like you mentioned, you go onto the website, you put in your inputs, and you get this code sheet output.
On the paid side, what other features do you have? Let's stop there first.
For sure. So a couple things, and it really goes back to how fragmented the industry is, because we have, like you mentioned earlier, like there's over 400,000 monthly active users, and those are people from all the way from a homeowner to a building inspector and everyone in between. So you have like architects, probably the largest bucket actually, GCs, plans examiners, tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, roofers, and everyone has their own requirements. They have their own workflows, and they deal with code in a different way. So when we think about the premium features, we start to create some of these features for the different workflows. So one that I'll mention is Code Compare. So it's the ability to look at two different codes of the same type. So building to building code, or plumbing to plumbing, or mechanical to mechanical, and see what the differences are either between a code year adoption. So if you're in California, what's the difference between 2019 and 2016 building code? Or if you're somewhere else, what's the difference between 2018 and 2015 building codes? And then highlighting the differences between the two, or between jurisdictions. And getting back into this kind of diverse, fragmented user base, a lot of people, if they're working on modular homes, or if it's a retailer setting up stores across the country, they might have to design for Florida and then jump into Washington State. And what are the differences between those two different jurisdictions, and how does the code vary in those adoptions? So that tool is pretty useful to highlight exactly what those differences are between these jurisdictions.
Gotcha. And that's the main feature?
Yep. Yeah. So that's a whole nother set. And then maybe I'll mention like this one, probably the third largest there, is code diagrams. So again, for a whole different kind of user segment, but this is taking the code text and explaining it in code or plain English, and then providing an illustration or diagrams. So if someone's not as familiar with the code, whether that's a junior person or middle level, or maybe they're diving into a new project type or a new jurisdiction, it's supplementing the raw text of the code with a kind of easy way to understand and interpret what does that code actually mean. So
gotcha. In the future, well, did you have? I think I remembered where you could download a plugin into Revit and it could run some analysis and tell you where you're breaking some codes. Does that still exist? And do you have plans for the future? Like, where are you taking this in the future, in the next 1 year? And then what's your like pie in the sky of what UpCodes can do?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So we spent some time developing a Revit plugin, and that takes your Revit model and then flags potential code errors in that model. Now, not all that many checks. It was a pretty early prototype, and I think it does 50 checks, primarily in the accessibility code, a little bit in the building code. And it turns out it's actually pretty, straightforward to identify simple code errors. So things like ramp slope or like landing width, stair runs, things like that. Pretty easy to tell if it's dimensional or you can pull it from the metadata. But it was a good validation, kind of like a good project into automatic code checking. But what we realized pretty quick is that we didn't really have an understanding of what the building was. So if we want to do more comprehensive checks, like travel distance, fire separations, we didn't know what the building was. Like we could look at it, tell you if that bathroom was accessible or not, but in the first place, does that bathroom even need to be accessible? Like what's the scoping of this building? Where are you located? What kind of occupancies do you have? And so we had to kind of take a pause, step back a little bit, and then dive into that code calculation that I mentioned earlier. And not to get too detailed here, but that's basically the bridge between UpCodes Web, the online database, and the UpCodes AI, which is the automatic BIM checker, is this code calculation. So now we can determine what are the scoping requirements for a building that will unlock us to go back into BIM checking, and then saying like, okay, now we know you need this many fixtures, we need this many accessible stalls, this many accessible bathrooms, here's your fire resistance ratings you need, and we can start to validate that. So to go back to your question, what's kind of like the pie in the sky long-term roadmap? It's very much on both sides. So on design, coming up with your code sheet saying what you need to design for, and then after that, validating if you have met those requirements. So we'll say, hey, you need to hit all these requirements. You can do your design, do the BIM model, and then on the other end, we can check that BIM model, make sure it matches up with all of the requirements.
Awesome. So in the future, either a planning department or just an architecture firm could check against codes automatically at the end, at the kind of the beginning and the end. That's the, how far away is that?
Yeah, great question. And I don't know if it would ever be 100%. We kind of view it as similar to like accounting software for accountants. I think it'll be a tool in their tool belt rather than like a replacement of that workflow. And that's kind of what we're building towards. So I'll just give that kind of caveat, which is, like I don't. It's never going to do the whole thing for you. Code is such a difficult space, and there's a lot of interpretation and design plays a big role. So we just want to be an aid in that flow. So, but if we're thinking about maybe like 50% completion of what we can check, I'd say maybe like 2 years, 3 years out, which sounds really long, but it's software. It takes so long to build, but that's kind of the goal is to get to that range.
Yeah. Everything that like is a concept, like a new car, it always seems so long. And then once you get to that year, you're like, oh man, that came quickly. Time flies. I'm still waiting for my Cybertruck, but I'm sure when they ask me for my huge down payment, I'll be like, whoa, that came up quickly.
Exactly. They have the challenge that Tesla created the prototype and put it out there so early that you kind of know what to expect, and now they need to like backfill and actually get to that production. Where for us, we approach it entirely differently, where it's we want to break it down to bite-sized chunks that we can start to ship it, get the feedback. It's like, hey, is this working for you guys? Like, does this fit into your workflow? And because we have to make assumptions and those need to be validated, and some are right, some are wrong. So it helps break it down to these chunks. I would just be terrified to like this, like the is it Cybertruck? The name of it? Yeah, yep. Cybertruck. I'd be terrified to, create that end goal and then, have it so set in stone you can't really iterate and change on the way to get to that end. Just an interesting tangent, but for us, it's always incremental step forwards in this compliance roadmap.
Yeah. If you could dive deeper, I think it's very interesting, the entrepreneurial journey of starting a firm. You've raised some funds, at least that I know of. That obviously had to be new to you because you come from the architecture world. What was that journey like? What was some hard lessons that or what was the process? Because starting an architecture firm is different than starting a software-based firm that needs funding by VCs and all that. So if you could dive into there, it's kind of open-ended question because I don't want to lead you into an answer.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. I wouldn't put that in the past tense. It's still, we still wrestle with it, and we're constantly learning new things. So like we very much are in the middle of like scaling the company and learning different functions. I think probably like the biggest difference was jumping into it and needing to learn so many different functions that I hadn't done before. So before, doing typical architecture work, you're not dealing with marketing. You're not dealing with sales unless you're, more senior in the firm, which I wasn't. So there's so many functions that are new to you, whether it's like, okay, what is good user interface design? What's user experience design? What does subscriptions look like? How do you manage the back end for subscriptions? And it was pretty like challenging in the first year or two just to learn all these new things, but very, very rewarding. And I would say like probably what made the biggest difference is just being surrounded by other folks who had gone through the same thing and being able to tap them. So if we're diving into marketing, we can go knock on the door of, the people that are experts in marketing for tech products and say, what did you guys learn? Can you give us some insight? And try to accumulate this knowledge from all the different experts in the field. So yeah, I would say like that's probably the biggest, when I think back to it, that's what stands out the most. But from a day-to-day tactical perspective, it's pretty interesting. Like you kind of get two camps of startups when it comes to tech products. One camp is heavily VC fueled, high burn. So they raise a bunch of money, they hire a big team, and they can work on a project and then worry about revenue way down the line. So very, very risky. And that's not the tact we took. We took the opposite tact, which was raise a little bit of money just to get you off the ground, but really focus on getting revenue early on so you can, I would call it baby steps, but like you're really breaking it down into digestible chunks where you can take on the next step and the next step and get users on board, get revenue, build the community, and then keep kind of rolling out new areas and aspects of the product, kind of going back to the earlier conversation. So don't shoot for that final thing. Break it down into smaller steps. And what is the smallest step you can ship and get feedback from users and work with the users, and until you make that one small piece more mature, and then you can add on another piece and then another piece and another piece where it starts to build up the bigger picture.
How many people work at UpCodes now?
So small team. We're 6 folks full time, and I think 8 contractors.
Gotcha. And then, so when you said that you had to, put on all these different hats, learn all these different, areas, and you mentioned you could go to, someone and ask, were you set up in a incubator system? Were you set up in a bunch of different offices? Were you just asking people online? Because with COVID, like it's different because there are incubators where everyone's there doing everything together, and it's like studio. You just turn to a guy that is better than you at that, and you ask him. Was it that, or was it?
Honestly, all of the above in excess. So we did an incubator. We did Y Combinator. So it's one based here in the Bay Area, and that was pretty incredible because you immediately get kind of plugged into a huge community of not just your current, what they call batchmates, like the companies in that cohort, but all the alums. And they have like a very vast network and kind of like an intranet of sorts that connects all the alums. So, and there's like a forum board on there. So that was probably the best place to be able to tap people and talk to people, and it could be done virtually. So like during COVID times, like that would, very much still work, and it does today for us. But we started obviously before COVID. And we absolutely like working in co-working spaces early on, meeting up for coffees and like meeting up with people in person to kind of tap their knowledge was massively beneficial. And then just like you said, that third bucket is just online communities. So in the software world, and this is kind of a big theme I've always kind of challenged or been frustrated with in architecture is the availability of these online communities. Because you compare what you can see in architecture with the software world, and software world is it's just immense. These forums are really, really robust and active discussions, and you can almost certainly any question you can have it answered in these forums. It probably was answered previously. If it hasn't been, in the rare case, you can post that question and you'll get answers within hours. Contrast that with architecture, like they're there in some capacity, but nothing like the software industry. So I think that's like a huge, I wouldn't call it opportunity, but just something that needs to be done. And I hope the industry can evolve more to be like more supportive, especially for like younger folks who need to like learn some of these new roles of, bridging between academia to practice. So so I will say like that was a huge thing for us, was diving into these online communities.
Yep. And then, sorry, someone just came in the office. I was going to ask, here's the question. So your brother back in the day was working for some tech company. You were working at some architecture firm. A lot of people know what architecture salaries are. A lot of people know that tech salaries are a little bit better, working at an established firm. Where was the point when one of you decided, or both of you decided to quit your job? Like, what was literally like that day or that week? Was it when you got accepted to Y Incubator? Take us back to that time.
Yeah. So yeah.
And was it like, I got to go sleep on mom's couch? I got to go sleep on my brother's couch, for a while? What happened?
Yeah. That's basically it. So, coming from myself from an architecture salary, had a little bit of savings, not a ton. Like living in New York, you don't save all that much money, especially early on. So I didn't, not a lot of savings. I started in New York, and we didn't pay ourselves for the first year or two. So we were, they call it like I think it's like ramen diet is like the term for it. But like, yeah, absolutely. Like we had to have a really, really low burn because we were operating off of primarily savings. This is before any VC money came in. And that was a really long time. Like not drawing a salary for a year or two was right on the edge of what I could manage with my meager savings at the time.
Did both of you quit or just one of you?
So I left first, and then Garrett, my brother, left, I think a few months after. So I left, worked in New York for a little bit, finished out my lease there, then moved to the West Coast to San Francisco. And I think I was crashing at his apartment at the time to keep expenses down. And then he left a couple months after that.
And what made you and then him decide, okay, we can leave our job? Is it just, hey, we just got to try it. If it doesn't work out, whatever, we're still young? Or was it, hey, we think we got a clear path here. It's just going to take some, time and effort. Which one was it?
Yeah, I think it was the second one. So, and going back earlier, like it was always, like iterating through the ideas, it was always supposed to be a segue for myself to get into the tech industry. And it would just be a fun kind of side project. So we launched it as such, and we hadn't quit our jobs, but it started to get more and more traction. So more and more users. And, today we have a little over the 400,000. At the time, it was way less, but it was still enough that it just showed a huge amount of promise and potential. And it was growing faster than we anticipated. So we just thought it was apologies here. I'm having a...
Yeah, no worries. I might cut this out if I do have the effort, but there's a fire truck going off over there. So you just pause for a second.
There we go. Yeah, sorry about that. We have a fire station just down the street, and we get a lot of fire trucks coming right by the office here.
He lives in a fire station. Yeah.
So it was really just the amount of traction that we were getting, and also the feedback. like again, mentioning like working as close as we can with the users and just chatting with people on the phone, meeting up with them in person, and just kind of feeling that that same pain point that I felt, and a lot of validation for, if we can relieve some of this friction and some of this pain, there might actually be a good opportunity here. That coupled with the amount of the traffic and the users we're getting, we're like, hey, you know what? Let's take a risk. Let's leave our respective jobs and dive in.
Did you have some monthly income coming in from the website?
We did pretty meager. I don't recall offhand, but it definitely was not enough to sustain the business. Like early days, like we were burning, with it, quote unquote burn, but basically like you're spending more money than you're bringing in, and that happened for a while. Yeah.
Gotcha. So right now you're kind of in a legal tussle with ICC because they develop the codes and basically say that you're using their copyright and all that. To be fair, I'm actually kind of one-sided on this argument. I'm on UpCodes side, only for the fact is that all these regulations are so onerous and there's so many of them and it's so complicated, and it's the government telling you what to do. It should be free and out and open to the public to use, manipulate. And for them, my opinion is for them to kind of hold a monopoly on it is squashing competition. And how I beat the other architecture firms is that I offer more service, I offer a better product, right? If you have a monopoly, you don't have to. Yes, they can say it's free and it's searchable online, but maybe it's really crappy searchable online. Maybe it's really great. Like if it was really great, then maybe you guys wouldn't exist, because they'd be like, why would we ever go to yours since theirs is so great and they're the ones who make it, right? So that competition just allows for a better product for me being selfish. There might be another UpCodes, I don't know what they'd call themselves, really UpCodes, right? That gives you some competition. That makes you have to, innovate. And I think that's all fair game. We all operate in that kind of market. So, just wanted to get kind of your position, your take, where you guys are at with them and what's happening there.
Yeah. And I will mention, like, exactly like you said, it is our stance too. You look at lawyers who we now have worked with like quite extensively, and they have a huge amount of tools in their tool belt. They have like the law has been for them, and what they deal with case law has been open for a long time. And you have all these companies, all these innovations that make it easier and easier for them to actually do their job and kind of automate and structure these workflows. So they have this huge ecosystem of tools at their disposal. But you compare that to architecture, engineering, construction, and the tools that we have to manage our compliance, and there was nothing. And it's very, very meager. Now we're trying to take a stab at that, and we're doing our kind of like a kind of humble like jump into that space. But with this lawsuit, and we can dive into the details, but we're starting to open up more and more of the codes into the public domain. So we had a bunch of really good kind of progress in our own lawsuit to open up the ICC codes. There's parallel cases. The one that went to the Supreme Court recently, that's like constantly opening up more and more. So I hope that in a couple of years' time, like we will have multiple, like you said, like multiple UpCodes in this space. Like we'll have competitors, we'll have people that are taking their own interesting tacks on it, and or approaches and angles to it, and maybe doing what we do, maybe doing something slightly different. But at the end of the day, the end user, the architect, engineer, GC is going to benefit from that, because then they're going to have multiple tools at their disposal. The competition will kind of heighten the push towards innovation. So I completely agree. And it's actually interesting, just to go to another thing you mentioned, they have suppressed innovation for so long. When we came along, so many people reached out. They're like, hey, how are you doing what you're doing? We tried to do something very similar, and they just reached out and just crushed us immediately before we got out of the gate. So, had they not been able to kind of put that legal pressure to stop other companies and innovations from happening, today we might have like 10 different companies that you could choose from, that you could apply to your projects and use. So I completely agree. I can give a high level kind of overview of the
please do
if that helps. So the ICC is a SDO, so Standards Development Organization, and they produce codes that they lobby and they spend a lot of money to get enacted into law. And those codes are actually written by volunteers, so industry professionals or government employees will contribute their time to write the codes. ICC will lobby to get those enacted into law. And our stance is that, if the intent of these things was to become law and then they were enacted into law, then it should be open for everyone to use. If it's binding legal text that you as a citizen have to follow, you should be able to read those laws that govern you.
Oh yeah, and do you remember the blue sheet in the beginning of the PDFs that said this is a legal document? You not knowing of this code does not relieve you of actually following this code. So like in the PDFs, it was basically a warning, like you need to know about this, and even if you don't, you still got to follow it. So allowing more people access to that is more compliance with the letter of the law.
Exactly. And it's interesting. Like you look at their mission statement, which I think is make the world or the built environment a safer place. Or I'm paraphrasing, but something along those lines. The accessibility board has the exact same mission statement, but they take the completely opposite approach, where they're like, hey, look, we want the built environment to be more accessible for folks. So whether that's wheelchair access or otherwise. And they promote as much as possible to get that information out there, and to let people work with it, copy, paste, print, and do all these different things. So you have very different approaches. One is like, hey, we're gonna try and clamp it down and control access, and we're the only ones who can kind of dole out the laws to you that you need to follow, compared to folks who are like, hey, we really want to make the built environment safer and better for accessible folks. We're going to pump it into the marketplace as much as possible.
Right. And this is a total tangent, but it's kind of an analogy to what you're doing. If you've ever read laws that are written, they are terribly written, meaning like they're just written by lawyers and they're terribly long and they're crazy, right? They're like 500 pages because we had to read these for the PPP loan. I have to read certain laws for certain reasons. It's as if a company came along and said, hey, we're going to put this in a completely different format that makes sense and digestible and something that you can read and learn and understand. That would be a great service. They probably don't want it because what they actually put in laws, if people actually knew how much the government gave to you and then actually gave to, other companies, big corporations, they'd probably be pissed, right? So again, this is a side tangent, but it's essentially taking a law and trying to make it as accessible and easy for the user as possible. And I almost think there's more opportunity for this in more different regions, not just in building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like a great example of that is TurboTax or H&R Block or
exactly
all those. Like I can't remember ever looking at an IRS document, like the raw document. Taxes now take me like 20 minutes. I just click through and like some of it's automatically populates from previous years or from a W-2. And that's exactly the way building code should be. Like it should be like, we should have lots of options, but it should be user friendly. It should kind of guide us down this way. And it's kind of like it's an interesting thing to think about, or proposition. Like, would there ever be a future where you don't look at the underlying document? And what would that look like? Like, I certainly don't have the answer there, but like if you took a pure TurboTax workflow and applied that to the building codes, what might that look like? And that's something we chat about. Don't have a good answer, unfortunately.
Right. No, but that makes entire sense. Instead of like citing the code about like you need a fire separation here for this, if somehow it just said, oh, your building got this big, you should put this firewall here, something like that. Yeah, I'm sure you thought about it more than me, but it's a very interesting concept that you're kind of divorcing it from the actual text into just something that kind of just happens, just kind of pops up or shows you or so Great ideas. I look forward to, your guys' future, what you're doing. Keep us posted. We'd like to have you back, in the future. So anytime, just reach back out. But I'll let you have the final words. Anything you want to let the listeners know, go ahead. Any way to get a hold of you, or what you want them to do, or how to just even get started in UpCodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just mention that it goes back to a lot of the themes we chatted about, but we love to chat and connect with the community as much as possible. So if you reach out to us in any means, whether it's email at support@up.codes, on Twitter @UpCodes, or the website, which is up.codes, like any way, if you just reach out to us, we'd love to chat. If you have any ideas, like to, just kick the tires on compliance and what could look like in the future, we always love having those conversations. And then of course, whether it's the free tier or not, like hopefully the site and the product can be helpful in your project. So definitely check it out, the website, or check us out at Twitter.
All right. Thanks a lot, Scott. It was great having you on.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.